Hey, good morning. I'm Pastor Stacey McClain with the First Baptist Church. I want to thank you once again for being with me. We're going to be studying the book of James, and today we'll be in James chapter 3. We'll be looking at verses 1 through 12. Let's start off with the idea of language. Language is a funny thing. As a pastor, I have an interesting perspective on language because I find that people, when they're around me, because they know that I'm a pastor, that they're careful with their language. They don't tell too many off-color jokes. They try to avoid swearing, or if they do swear in front of me, they tend to apologize. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. I don't know if they think that I'm going to call down fire from heaven. I don't know if they think that my ears are so pure. I've never heard these words before, or perhaps I don't even know what they mean. Full disclosure here, I did go to public schools, public high school. I went to a public university. And I know the definitions, I think, of all of the major curse words. I got that figured out. I know that one particular word can be used as a noun, a verb, an adverb, and an adjective. I understand that. But language is interesting. When I'm around people who I don't know, and they don't know what I do, but we get, comfortable. We begin to talk. And all of a sudden, they start off with this litany of filth. And then all of a sudden, they find out what I do. Then they turn beet red, or they turn pale, or they break out in a sweat. And from my perspective as a pastor, I think it's a little bit funny. It's one of the perverse little pleasures that we get in the ministry, I suppose. But for myself, as a pastor, my profession requires that I use language. And I try to express myself well. I try to be accurate. I try to say things with the right tone. And I believe that most of the time, the majority of the time, I do. But there are times when I don't, and boom, I blow people up, or I use an inappropriate illustration, or I say something that I should not say. And I don't mean to offend people, and I don't mean to turn people off, but I do. I am not a perfect person. And you're like, yeah, well, we already know that. Thank you, Captain Obvious. Yeah. So language is tough. People around me struggle. I struggle. We all struggle with the control of our mouths. And what James is going to do in the 3rd chapter here is talk about that very topic for 13 verses. And he wants us to understand that we need to be a people who watch our mouths. Our tongues were created by God, and they were created to bless God and not for our baloney. One of the best ways that we can take our spiritual temperature to find out how we are doing in our relationship with God is to take an inventory of the things which we have said. What have I said? Why have I said it? How have I said it? What were my intentions? Because the language which you use, the words which we use, the things which we talk about, give us an indication as to what is in our hearts. So as we come now to James chapter 3, it's a little bit of an odd section because James has been speaking to people who have been persecuted. They're having a great amount of difficulty. And as we come to James chapter 3, it's a little strange for us because it's hard to understand exactly how James chapter 3 goes along with the previous 2 chapters. It's almost as if it's a separate wisdom piece about the use of language. And perhaps that's exactly what it is. But so we'll look at this section almost as a standalone section within the book of James. So James chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Let me read those first 2 verses for you, and then we'll make some comments. James says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body." Now, as we look at this, James is not speaking to teachers, at least not directly. He's teaching to those who would like to be teachers. And he is warning those who aspire to be teachers to be careful for what they're wishing for. Because along with teaching comes communication. And as we can communicate in a way which is inappropriate or in a way which blows people up. And we have to be very, very careful about this. Along with teaching comes a greater responsibility. Now, again, would a person want to become a teacher? Perhaps there's some sort of prestige which goes along with it. Perhaps they can be considered a rabbi or whatever the case may be. But along with the prestige of teaching, remember, there comes a great responsibility. I'm reminded of Matthew in Matthew chapter 23. And in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus lets the scribes and the Pharisees, he really does let them have it and lets them know that they are in a position of authority, but the things which they're saying and the lives which they're living do not correspond with godliness. And in Matthew chapter 23, we have here what we'll call the 7 woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's quite long, but let me give you a sampling of it. And Jesus starts off Matthew chapter 23 and verse 13. But woe to the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe, second woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across the sea and land to make a single proselyte. And when you come across a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Third woe. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if you swear by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by an oath. And this is quite a long section about that, about swearing. That is, putting yourself under an oath. Fourth woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others, you blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgences. And on he goes. Verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanliness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisies and lawlessness. Verse 7, or the seventh woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. And you are saying basically, hey, if we lived at those times, we would not have been involved with the persecution of the prophets. And Jesus says, all you do is confess that you are the sons of murderers. Listen, if you're going to put yourself into some sort of position, a position of leadership, especially in leadership that has a spiritual dimension to it, your language and your actions better correspond. You can't be a person who says one thing and acts in another way. God is not impressed with that. And frankly, God is not fooled, and neither are the people around you. Now, notice here, if we continue on in James 3, he says, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with a greater strictness. For we, again, he's inclusive, for we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he's a perfect man. And James looks at this and he says, I'm a teacher. I'm part of this. And we have to be careful with the things which we say because we are judged with a greater strictness. I mean, Jesus doesn't give a 7 woe list to the lepers or the prostitutes or the tax collectors, but he does give a 7 woe list to the scribes and the Pharisees because they have been given a particular position, a position where they are to be speakers and livers of the truth, and they were not. So James says, hey, be careful. Be careful with taking the responsibility of teaching. There's the old saying, it's kind of cute. It says, the tongue being in a wet place is apt to slip. And we do this. We make mistakes. Don't expect perfection from your pastors, okay? That can't happen. I mean, expect a high level, don't get me wrong, but understand that they are not perfect individuals. I remember when I first started my first official ministry that I was involved with, I told the youth pastor of our church, I said, I'd like to be involved. I'd like to go ahead and work with some of the kids. I was a college student at the time. And he says, great. And so, what do you do with fresh meat, if you will? You put them with the junior higher. So I was assigned to the junior high classroom. And there were already, people working with the junior hires, but there I was the new guy, and I didn't know the students. And I remember the main teacher had asked a question, and people were talking, but there's one kid off to my left and wasn't saying anything, wasn't saying anything. And I said, well, I'd like to know what this young man would have to say. And I pointed with my hand. I looked at this particular person. So everybody in the classroom turned and looked at this person, knew exactly who I was addressing. They heard exactly what I said. And unfortunately, this was not a young man, but it was a young girl with her hair cropped really, really tight. And she wanted to crawl into a hole, and I wanted to crawl into another hole. And everybody in the room was embarrassed because of what I had just said. Yeah. Yeah, and here I am blowing up a person. You get this junior high girl, and I still to this day I'm horrified. And it was not an intentional thing, but it happens. And what James says is, listen, if you don't stumble, you're the perfect man. But again, even that statement from James is a theoretical statement, because James has already said we all stumble, including himself. If we could control our tongues, we would do quite well, but we don't. Now, I want us to extrapolate a little bit here. I mean, James is speaking about the main way that people would communicate in the first century. Now, basically, you're going to communicate in the first century. You're going to communicate through oral speech, okay? But also, you can communicate through writing, such as James right here. But when we look at the way that we communicate today, that's one of the things which we have. We can communicate in amazing different ways. We can message people. We can Facebook people. We can Zoom. We can send emails. We can still write letters. We can live stream. We can snap, crackle, and pop. We can do all kinds of ways to communicate with people, but understand how you communicate matters to God. Because with the things which you say, it gives a snapshot of what your heart is like. Now, James, he continues on in the third verse. He develops his thinking, and he wants to talk about this, this floppy piece of flesh which is in our mouth. And he wants to talk about the incredible power which it has. Let's look at verses 3-5. We'll just take it slowly as we go through this. But he gives here a number of illustrations, 3 illustrations, I believe. Verse 3, he says, if we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies. So he's saying, listen, he said, small tongues have incredible powers. In the natural world, small little things can have an incredible power. So if you take a bit and you put it into a horse's mouth, you can control a massive animal. The Clydesdale horses. Now that's not a horse that you get on the back of it and ride, not normally. But those horses weigh over a ton, over 2,000 pounds. And if you put a bit within that horse's mouth, you can control it to go where you want it to go. I mean, a regular horse that, you go to a ranch someplace and you want to go on a tour with the horse, it's going to be about 1,000 pounds or more. So you can take a half-ton animal and control it. Even a rookie can control a horse like that. I remember Elise and I, we were on our honeymoon, and, we decided to go on a horseback tour. And so there we are, we're in Leavenworth, and we're going up into the mountains around Leavenworth. And as we went up there, the horses, we had a guide with us, and then there was us too, and the horses began to act strange, okay? And what had happened is that there was a dead animal up the road, okay? And the horses did not care for this. So that spooked them a little bit, but then as we turned the corner, we came across a free-range shepherd. So evidently there's fields up there, and there's modern day shepherds really, and they could take their sheep up there and they could graze their sheep. And the way that the shepherd kept the sheep under control was he had several dogs. And here I am, and Elise has ridden a lot of horses. I had not. And all of a sudden, one of the shepherd's dogs, who was already kind of freaked out because of the smell in the air, decided to take off after the back of my horse. And my horse said, that'll be about enough of that. And my horse turned, and we were on one of those roads that are cut into the side of a hill. We're just going up the hill, and he turned and he went up the embankment, and that horse took off. And I put my head down behind the horse's head, and we're going through the trees. And eventually I'm able to get this 1,000-pound animal to stop and to turn around. And I come back to the embankment, and the guide, he says, just lean back and come on down. And I lean back and I woohoo, like the man from Snowy River, and I come on down. But here I am as a rookie, able to control this very large animal. And why? Because I've got a bit in the mouth. Small things have power. Small things can have a big effect. His next example is one of seafaring. He says, look at the ships also, though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. We live here close to the port of Tacoma, and we have these seafaring ocean container vessels, and they come in. We were just taking pictures, last week down at the port of Tacoma, and you get these large seafaring vessels who go through massive seas, and they have these containers which contain everything from vehicles to grain. And here they come into the port, and these huge ships are controlled by a relatively small rudder. What James is saying, he says, listen, you get ships out there, large ships, and they're even blown. They're blown by massive winds, and yet they're controlled by the pilot's rudder. Amazing thing. Now, the third example which he gives is this of the forest fire, or the small fire which turns into the forest fire. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. It just takes a little bit. It just takes a spark, if you will. When I was, I think it was junior high age, my oldest brother, he got married. And when he got married, we were pretty excited about it as the younger brothers, because we were given a license towards vandalism. And what we were able to do is we were able to, decorate the car with all kinds of stuff and attach the cans and all that type of thing. And so for us, that was great. I mean, we were given permission to be, a little bit wicked. And so that's what we did. We had a great time with that. And I remember my brother had come back. I think he had an old Rambler is what it was. And, a week after the wedding and whatnot. And it was so much fun to vandalize the first time. We decided that we would do it a second time. And my parents, because they owned a ceramic shop, they had all of this shredded paper so they could pack things. And so we took all of this shredded paper, my brother, myself, I think a couple of the neighbor kids as well. And we packed the Rambler full of paper, it was stuffed full. And we were just finishing up, and all of a sudden my dad comes around the corner, and my dad said, no, your license has already expired. No more vandalism for you. And we're like, oh, but we're just having fun. And Dad said, take it all out. Great. So this thing is packed with shredded paper. And so we're like, all right. And so we began to take it out. And then inspiration struck me, I happened to have in my pocket, a pack of matches, because back in the day, all children were given matches to play with. That's how it was. So you had, 4th of July was probably close by. So you were always lighting something on fire. And here was this nice little strings of paper. And I decided to light one. So I lit one little piece of paper, and everybody went, hey, that's, that was pretty cool. And I said, we could start it on fire. And like, yeah, careful. And I said, yeah, you're right. And so I took the string of paper and I blew it out, and I threw it back onto the pile. Well, you know what happens sometimes? And it happened this particular time that when I blew it out, it did go out. And when I threw it back, guess what? It lit back. And this one string of paper hit the rest of the paper, which was still in the car. And all of a sudden, by the grace of God, we were able to grab the shredded paper, pull it out, even though there's a bit of a flame, and pull it out before the car was set on fire. Okay. If my brother's watching this, you didn't know this, but yeah, we did save your car. And Dad, I know you didn't know it. I know that. So yeah, so we got it was all good. But my point is this. You can take a stupid small one little strand of shredded paper and you can destroy something massive. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with our words. We can burn down people's lives with the things which we say. We can blow people up. It's just a small bit. And a small bit is powerful. Small things have a big effect. Now, the tongue may be small. You say, okay, it's small, so we can control it. No. We're very poor at controlling it. It may be small, but it is powerful and it is very, very difficult for us to control. You know, Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 12, once again rebuking the Pharisees this particular time. Matthew chapter 12, verse 34. He says, "You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." Listen, you may dress up all pretty, but you show your heart with your words. What are you saying? How are you saying it? Why are you saying it? Small tongues are difficult to control. Let's look at verses 6 through 8. I'm going to summarize some of this. He uses lots of illustrations. I think some of those are very easy to understand, but look at what he calls the tongue in verse 6. And the tongue is a fire. Speaking of fire, the tongue is actually a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, set on fire by hell. Look at that. If you were to summarize it, you would say this: the tongue is a fire. It is a world of unrighteousness. It is a stain in our life. It is hellfire which ravages our lives. It's almost as if it would be better for us if we had been born without a tongue, that we'd be mute. But once again, we have to understand that even if we were mute, we would communicate in another way, and so that we would still be liable for the things which we communicate. The answer is not to pull your tongue out. Your answer is to change your heart. And that's why I came back to Matthew chapter 12. How can you speak good when you're evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And we need to be a people who have a transformed heart, an ever and ongoing transformed heart. You can't just say, oh, by the way, I'm a Christian, and so therefore my heart is good and it's all perfect. No. This is an ongoing matter of sanctification. Tongues are difficult. They're difficult to control. They may be small, but they're difficult to control. He says, animals are controllable, but the tongue's not so much. Look at verse 7. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. We can add that to the list we already had before. The idea of the tongue being a fire, a world of unrighteousness, a stain in our life, hellfire which ravages our lives. We can add those last two things, a restless evil and a deadly poison, add that to the list. But he says, you can train animals, but you don't train your tongue so well. My dog Gretel, I can train her to sit and to lie down. She'll do that by voice command. She'll do that by hand command. Animals are trainable. When I was in junior high or high school, early high school, I had a parakeet. Somebody told me that you can teach parakeets to speak. I'm not so sure that's true. And so I had this parakeet. He's certainly not learning anything. He's not learning how to speak. So we decided, what's the next best thing? See if you could do him some tricks. And if you own a bird, you want your bird to be able to sit upon, your finger and to sit upon your shoulder. And slowly but surely, we're able to do that. And then my room was downstairs. We wanted the bird to learn how to fly around the room. And you know what? We got the bird out and we let him go, and he was like a tennis ball off the walls. Bam, 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 bam. And the poor little bird, I'm surprised he didn't break his little neck, but we were able to capture him and get him back on the shoulder. But you know what? We let him loose a couple of times. You know what he did? He was able to figure it out, and he was able to fly around the room and fly around the room and fly around the room. A bird brain can learn these things. We can control the bird. We can teach him a few things. But man, we are bad at controlling that tongue and to training that tongue and getting it under the control it should be under. Now, some of you are here and saying, wait a second, if the tongue is a restless evil and it's evil and full of poison and it's a hellfire and on goes the list, maybe I should just shrug my shoulders and say, well, there's not much I can do about that. Well, hold on a second. Once again, go back to Matthew chapter 12 and verse 34. You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of your heart, the mouth speaks. And I think the answer to our language is to be a people who have an ever growing relationship with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And as we are closer to him, it changes our words. If you're having difficulty with words, if you're having difficulty with language, how's your relationship with Jesus? I have had friends throughout my life who, because they know I don't swear very much, they watch their language, and sometimes I will never even hear them swear, and then all of a sudden in other contexts I hear it all the time. People have the ability to change the way they speak based upon the audience they're around. I want you to understand that God is always your audience. And again, I think we need to extrapolate the idea of language to communication into our modern times. And so our language is not just the things which we say. Well, it's not just about curse words, just put it that way. Because you can have cursing, but you can also have biting criticism, or you can have manipulation, or you can have gossip, or you can have slander, you can have intimidation, and the list goes on. We all have work to do to be better in the things that we say. And I think the key here is to grow in our relationship with Jesus. Now, as we come to the fourth section of this passage, James is wrapping up with a number of his own illustrations. But the primary idea here is that he is asking us to avoid duplicity or avoid being two-faced, if you will. And he has a number of illustrations towards the end. So James chapter 3, let's look at verses 9 through 12. He says, with it, that is the tongue, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. You can't go around singing hymns to God and cussing out people and cursing people, because people are made in the image of God. As human beings made in the image of God, one of the ideas here is that we are walking on the face of this earth representing the God who created us. And you can't look at the symbol which represents God and curse it and say, oh, but I love God. It's like somebody who has a flag and they light it on fire. And they light it on fire. Why? Because they want to protest not the flag, not the fabric in itself, but they want to protest what the flag stands for. That is the country, for example. You can't take a human being and throw rocks at it and curse at it and spit at it and say, well, I hate the representative, I hate the flag, but I love God. It doesn't work that way. You can't do that. John talks about this and says there's an inconsistency here. John says in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 20, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. Don't tell me about your love for God when you're hating the people which you see. Because the people which you see, they're tangible, they're right there. And James says, the blessing and the cursing, they're going to come from the same mouth? This should not happen. This should not happen. Christian, I want you to understand, when you do this, people take note. People say, Christians, bunch of hypocrites. And let me say something. Hopefully this is not controversial in and of itself. Yeah, Christians are hypocrites. We are not fully consistent. We are works in process. If you're trying to find the perfect church with no hypocrites in it, you're going to find an empty church building, but you're not going to find one that has people in it. I know that one of the great criticisms that people cringe about, Christians are hypocrites. Yeah, I get that. That's because we're an ongoing process. That's not to give us coverage to say, we can do what we want and not take things seriously. We are to be a people who take the charge of hypocrisy seriously and try to be less hypocritical. That's our goal. And perfection's our goal. But if we're not going to have perfection, we certainly want to be less hypocritical. Again, people are watching. Now look at the rest of his illustrations. We'll take these just briefly as a group. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening fresh and salt water? Well, obviously no. Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives? Obviously no. Or a grapevine produce figs? Obviously no. Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. Of course, that's true. James is saying, listen, you want to become a teacher, then watch out, because you're going to be judged more strictly. You just are. And the tongue's a small thing, but it's powerful. And though it's small, it's something which is very, very difficult to control. No matter what, watch out that you are not two-faced, that you're not duplicitous. As Christians, we need to speak with the accent of our Father. Children of God should sound like their Father. I have 4 boys. And when my children get old enough and somebody calls on the phone and one of my boys picks up, they don't know who they're talking to. Yeah, Stacey. No. This is, and the son says his name. And the reason why is because a son picks up the sound of his father. I mean, there's genetics there, but there's also cadence and familiarity. We are to be a people who are so in tune with God that we speak the things of God. And we should be living out the things of God as well. Speak with his accent. You say, well, language is not that big of a deal. James says, yes, it is. It is a measurement, a temperature, if you will, of your relationship with God. And again, foul language is not, that's part of it, but I think that's a small part of it. It's not so much about particular swear words which you can't say according to the FCC on the radio, but it includes other things such as gossip and threats and intimidation and crassness and biting criticism and nagging and lies and slanders, and on we go. What are you saying? How are you saying it? And why are you saying it? Let us be people who watch our mouths and speak with the accent of the Father. James, a practical book. A difficult book because it challenges is a challenge for us in our very daily lives. God, help us to be people who love you and follow you, and help us to watch our mouths. Again, I thank you for being with me this morning, and may you be blessed. May you be blessed. Thanks again. God bless.